What if the moon is not a natural satellite, but a machine placed in orbit 13,000 years ago? And what if it's still watching? Look up tonight. That pale disk has hung in our sky for as long as human memory reaches back. We've walked on it, measured it, mapped its surface down to the meter. And yet, when Apollo 12 jettisoned its lunar module in 1969 and it struck the surface with the force of 1 ton of TNT, seismometers recorded something impossible. The moon rang like a bell for over an hour. Not a dull thud, not the expected seismic decay, a sustained metallic reverberation that suggested the surface was a shell over something hollow. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're drawn to questions that sit at the edge of what we're allowed to ask. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this question spreading across time zones, a chain of people lying awake in the dark, staring at the same object, wondering if it's staring back. Tonight, we're going to examine what happens when orbital mechanics, ancient myth, and cataclysmic geology point to the same unsettling conclusion. The moon arrived. Chapter 1: The Stranger in the Sky. What if every night of your life you've been staring at a machine, not a rock, not a natural satellite captured by chance, a machine placed there with precision so absolute it defies the mathematics of accident, positioned at a distance so perfect that it creates solar eclipses of impossible beauty, locked into an orbit so stable it shows you the same face, always, like a mask that never turns away. Tonight, step outside, look up, feel the moonlight on your skin, that pale, cold luminescence that has lit every human night since the oldest stories began. The light feels gentle, doesn't it? Familiar, comforting even. But there's something else beneath the comfort, something you've felt, but never named. The sensation of being seen. Before we go further, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you're drawn to questions that sit at the intersection of ancient memory and cosmic unease. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this spreading across time zones, a chain of listeners lying awake in the dark, all staring at the same object in the sky, all beginning to wonder if it's staring back. The story begins not with mythology, not with conspiracy theories, but with numbers. Cold, precise, undeniable numbers that have troubled astronomers since we first developed the mathematics to measure what we see. The moon sits in our sky at an average distance of 384,400 kilometers from Earth. This number means nothing in isolation. It's just distance, just empty space measured in units we invented to make the cosmos feel knowable. But place that number beside another, and something breaks. The sun sits 149,000 kilometers away. Again, meaningless alone. But now divide. The sun is approximately 400 times farther from Earth than the moon. And here's where the accident becomes impossible. The sun's diameter is approximately 400 times larger than the moon's diameter. Read that again slowly. The moon is 400 times closer than the sun. The sun is 400 times larger than the moon. These two ratios, working together, create a phenomenon that exists nowhere else in the solar system. They produce perfect solar eclipses. Total eclipses, where the moon's disk covers the sun's disk so exactly that the solar corona becomes visible as a halo of fire around a circle of perfect darkness. Not partial eclipses, like those visible from Mars when Phobos crosses the sun as a tiny dot. not near misses. Exact coverage. The moon fits over the sun the way a lens cap fits over a camera lens. Designed, manufactured, threaded to precise tolerances. In 1961, astronomer Fred Hoyle calculated the probability of this ratio occurring by chance. His findings disturbed him enough that he wrote, "A natural explanation seems to be ruled out. The arrangement seems too perfect to be accidental." Other astronomers dismissed his discomfort. "Coincidences happen," they said. "The universe is vast. Improbable things occur simply because there are so many opportunities for them to occur." But Hoyle understood something they didn't, or perhaps something they refused to acknowledge. The moon's distance isn't static. It's receding from Earth at approximately 3.8 centimeters per year. This means in the deep past, the moon was closer, and in the deep future, it will be farther. The window of time during which perfect solar eclipses are possible, where the ratios align so exactly, is cosmically brief. A few million years out of billions, and it just happens to be now. The exact epoch when a conscious species capable of observing and measuring the phenomenon exists on Earth. The exact era when beings with eyes and mathematics can stand on the surface and watch the clockwork mechanism perform its function. What are the odds? The question sits in your mind differently now, doesn't it? The moonlight feels colder because we're not finished with the numbers. The moon's orbit is nearly circular. Most natural satellites have elliptical orbits, elongated paths that bring them closer and farther from their parent planet in regular cycles. The moon's eccentricity, the measure of how elongated an orbit is, sits at 0.0549. For comparison, Mercury, a planet that formed in our solar system's gravitational well, has an eccentricity of 0.2056. The moon's orbit is more circular than the orbit of a planet shaped by 4.5 billion years of solar gravity. Natural capture of a satellite produces elliptical orbits. It's a consequence of gravitational mechanics. When a planetary body captures a passing object, the resulting orbit is elongated, chaotic, gradually circularizing over geological time through tidal interactions. But the moon's orbit shows minimal signs of this process. It's too clean, too stable, as if it was placed rather than captured. Then there's the inclination. The moon's orbital plane is tilted approximately 5 degrees relative to Earth's ecliptic, the plane of Earth's orbit around the sun. This is unusual. Most satellites orbit near their planet's equatorial plane, captured by the rotation of the planet itself. The moon ignores Earth's equator entirely. Its orbit references the sun, not Earth. It behaves less like Earth's satellite and more like a separate planet in solar orbit that happens to be gravitationally bound to Earth. Astronomer Erwin Shapiro at MIT noted in 1970 that the moon's orbital characteristics would be more consistent with artificial placement than natural formation. The paper was published, noted, then quietly absorbed into the background noise of academic discourse. No one wanted to follow that thread, because following it leads somewhere uncomfortable. But perhaps the most disturbing characteristic isn't mathematical, it's observational. It's something every human who has ever looked up has experienced, but rarely articulates. The moon is always watching, tidal locking. That's the technical term. The moon rotates on its axis at exactly the same rate it orbits Earth, which means the same hemisphere always faces us. We never see the far side from Earth's surface, not naturally, not until spacecraft flew around it in 1959 and photographed what had been hidden since the moon arrived in orbit. Tidal locking is common in the solar system. Most large satellites eventually become tidally locked to their parent planets through gravitational interactions over millions of years. But the moon's tidal locking is perfect. No wobble, no libration significant enough to reveal substantially more surface. Just the same face, eternal, watching. Ancient cultures understood this viscerally. They didn't have the mathematics to explain tidal locking, but they felt its weight. Nearly every mythology personifies the moon as an eye, not a light source, an eye. The Sumerian moon god Sin was called he who illuminates, but his primary function wasn't illumination. It was measurement and observation. Sin counted the days, marked the months, watched the cycles of human activity, and reported them to the higher gods. His symbol was a crescent, yes, but always depicted with the horns pointing upward, like a cup or a boat, a vessel designed to collect and hold. In Egypt, the moon was divided between Thoth and Khonsu. Thoth, god of writing and knowledge, measured and recorded. Khonsu, the traveler, moved through the sky observing the earth. Both functions implied active watching, not passive presence. The Eye of Horus, that ubiquitous symbol of Egyptian power, represented both solar and lunar aspects. It was an eye that saw, that remained open, that never blinked. Greek Selene, Roman Luna, Hindu Chandra, across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the moon is conscious. It possesses awareness. It knows what happens beneath it. Why? Why would independent cultures, with no contact during their formative periods, all describe the moon in terms of observation rather than simple luminescence? The sun is described as fire, as warmth, as life-giving energy. The moon is described as watching, perhaps because unlike the sun, which illuminates indiscriminately, the moon's light feels directional. It falls on you like a gaze. Stand in a field under a full moon, and you can feel it. Not warmth, not comfort, but attention. Something looking down from the silent dark, painting you in silver, marking your position. Modern astronomy dismisses this as anthropomorphism. Primitive humans, afraid of the dark, projected consciousness onto a lifeless rock to make the night less terrifying. But what if the causality runs backward? What if ancient peoples, closer to the trauma of the moon's arrival, remembered what it was? What if they personified it as an eye not out of fear of the dark, but because they recognized what they were looking at? The Younger Dryas cataclysm struck approximately 12,800 years ago. We'll examine this in detail in coming chapters, but for now, understand this. It marks the boundary where nearly every flood myth, every story of world destruction, every narrative of a golden age followed by catastrophe clusters together. Before 12,800 BC, we find almost no permanent settlements, no monumental architecture, no cities. After 10,000 BC, suddenly, Göbekli Tepe appears in Turkey, massive stone circles built by people who supposedly had no agriculture, no metal tools, no organizational structure capable of mobilizing that kind of labor. What changed? The standard narrative says the climate warmed, ice sheets melted, humans transitioned from nomadic hunting to settled farming, and civilization bootstrapped itself from survival into complexity. But another pattern sits beneath that comfortable story, a pattern written in myth, but ignored by archaeology because archaeology only accepts evidence it can dig up. And anything that existed before 12,800 BC on Earth's coastlines, where all civilizations naturally develop, now rests under 400 feet of ocean water, drowned when the ice melted and sea levels rose, buried under millennia of marine sediment where we cannot excavate, cannot reach, cannot prove existed. Unless the moon remembers, unless the moon was placed there specifically to watch what happens after a reset, to observe whether the experiment restarts correctly, to ensure the prison stays locked, or the zoo stays contained, or the farm stays productive, whatever metaphor fits the function. Stand outside tonight. Look up at that pale disk hanging in the black. Notice how it doesn't twinkle like stars do. Stars flicker because their light passes through miles of turbulent atmosphere. The moon shines steady, constant, unblinking. Feel the light on your skin, cold light. Not the warmth of the sun, which feeds life, but something else. Reflected light, they tell us. Sunlight bouncing off a dead, cratered surface. But reflected light shouldn't feel like this. It shouldn't carry weight. It shouldn't make you aware of your own visibility. The moon is 3,174 kilometers in diameter, roughly 1/4 the diameter of Earth. No other planet in our solar system has a moon so large relative to its parent body. Mars has 2 tiny captured asteroids. Jupiter and Saturn have dozens of moons, but even the largest, Ganymede and Titan, are small compared to their massive planets. Pluto has Charon, which is proportionally large, but Pluto isn't a planet anymore. We demoted it specifically because its relationship with Charon is too binary, too balanced, too much like a double planet system rather than a planet-satellite relationship. Earth and Moon sit in that same uncomfortable category. We're not a planet with a captured satellite. We're a binary system where one partner is much larger than the other. The center of mass, the barycenter around which both bodies orbit, sits not at Earth's core, but about 1,700 kilometers beneath Earth's surface, still inside the planet, but displaced significantly outward by the moon's mass. This configuration is rare, so rare that it demands explanation. And the official explanation, that a Mars-sized object called Theia collided with early Earth and the debris coalesced into the moon, creates as many problems as it solves. If the moon formed from Earth's mantle, why is its composition different? Why does it lack a substantial iron core? Why is its oxygen isotope signature identical to Earth's, suggesting common origin, but its overall chemistry distinct, suggesting separate origin? The Theia hypothesis requires an impactor hitting at precisely the right angle, at precisely the right velocity, fragmenting in precisely the right way to produce a disk of debris that coalesces into a single large moon rather than a ring system or multiple small moons. The odds of this happening sit somewhere between astronomically unlikely and functionally impossible, and yet we accept it because the alternative, that the moon arrived from elsewhere and was placed into orbit with intention, is unthinkable, not impossible, unthinkable, because thinking it destabilizes everything. Tonight, the moon crosses the sky above you at approximately 1 kilometer per second. It completes one orbit every 27.3 days. It has done this for thousands of years, reliable as a clock. More reliable, actually. Our clocks are calibrated to its motion. Our months are carved from its cycles. Our languages preserve the connection, Month this derives from moon, the measurement of time based on the measurement of its face. The tides rise and fall in rhythm with its passage. Oceans bulge toward it, pulled by gravity that reaches across 384,400 kilometers of void to tug at water, at coastlines, at the liquid interior of the planet itself. This is power, physical, measurable, undeniable power exerted across space. And if the moon can pull water, if it can drag entire oceans into rhythmic motion, what else can it affect? What else responds to its presence? The human body is approximately 60% water. The brain floats in cerebrospinal fluid. Blood flows in tidal rhythms, pumped by a heart that beats roughly 100,000 times per day. Does the moon pull at us too? Ancient cultures believed it did. The word lunacy derives from luna, moon madness. Full moons were feared, avoided, locked away from. Werewolves transformed under the full moon. Witches gathered beneath it. Psychiatric hospitals reported increased agitation in patients when the moon was full, a correlation studied, dismissed, studied again, dismissed again, but never fully resolved because the data keeps suggesting something happens even if we can't explain the mechanism. What if the mechanism is deliberate? What if the moon doesn't just create tides in the ocean, but tides in consciousness? What if it's light, cold, steady, constant, operates on frequencies biological systems respond to, not mystically, mechanically, the way radio waves carry information, the way Wi-Fi signals pass through walls, invisible but measurably real? We'll explore this in depth later, but for now, hold the question. Let it sit uncomfortably in the back of your mind where it belongs, where all good questions about the moon eventually settle, in the space between what we're told and what we feel when we stand alone at night and look up at something that might be looking back. The moon hangs in the sky tonight, exactly as it hung 10,000 years ago. Same face, same distance, approximately. Same steady presence. Civilizations have risen beneath it. Empires have fallen. Languages have been born, flourished, died, and been forgotten. The moon remains. It watched the first cities rise in Mesopotamia. It illuminated the construction of the pyramids. It shone on the fall of Rome, the Black Death, the World Wars. It watches now as you read these words, as cities glow beneath its light, as ships navigate by its position, as satellites circle Earth in orbits calibrated to avoid its gravitational influence. Perfect solar eclipses occur on Earth approximately every 18 months somewhere on the planet's surface. Each one draws crowds of observers who travel vast distances to stand in the moon's shadow and watch the clockwork mechanism perform. The sun disappears behind a black disk. The corona emerges like fire around void. Daylight becomes twilight. Stars appear. The temperature drops. And for a few minutes, observers stand in the presence of something that feels less like astronomy and more like revelation. Then it ends. The moon continues its orbit. The sun reappears. Life resumes, and the witnesses disperse, carrying the memory of darkness at noon, of standing beneath a machine that works with such precision it feels intentional. Because perhaps it is. Perhaps the moon was placed in orbit at exactly the right distance to create perfect eclipses, not as a side effect, but as a message, a demonstration of precision, a signature written in orbital mechanics, visible to any species that develops the mathematics to measure what it sees. A way of saying, this was built, this was placed, This is not natural. Look up and know you are not alone. You have never been alone. We are watching. The moonlight falls through your window tonight, as it has fallen every night of your life. Cold, silver, steady. You've spent your entire existence beneath it, sleeping under its gaze, waking to its absence, marking time by its phases, without ever asking the question that should have been first. Why is it so perfect? Why does it fit so exactly? Why does it never turn away? The answer, preserved in seismic data, in ancient texts, in orbital mechanics and flood myths and biological rhythms, waits in the chapters ahead. But already you feel it, don't you? That subtle shift in perception. The moon isn't quite what you thought it was. The light isn't quite as gentle. The night isn't quite as empty. Something is up there. Something has always been up there. And in the next chapter, we'll examine the moment when that something rang like a bell's and revealed what the ancients already knew. The moon is hollow, and hollow things are built, not born. Chapter 2, The Metallic Echo, November 20th, 1969. The Apollo 12 mission had accomplished what seemed impossible just months after Armstrong's first steps, a second successful lunar landing, this time with pinpoint precision. Astronauts Charles Conrad and Alan Bean had spent hours on the surface, deployed scientific instruments, collected samples, and prepared for departure. What happened next would haunt researchers for decades. At 12:18 UTC, the ascent stage of the lunar module lifted off, carrying the astronauts back to the command module orbiting above. The descent stage, the lower portion of the lander, now empty and useless, remained behind on the lunar surface. Mission Control had planned something unprecedented. Rather than leave the descent stage where it sat, they used the ascent stage's trajectory to guide it into a controlled impact back onto the moon's surface, approximately 72 kilometers from the landing site. The purpose was scientific. Apollo 12 had deployed seismometers, sensitive instruments designed to detect vibrations traveling through the lunar subsurface. By creating a known impact at a known location, NASA could analyze how seismic waves propagated through the moon's interior. They expected results similar to what seismometers record on Earth during earthquakes. A sharp initial spike as the shock wave arrives, then gradual decay as the energy dissipates through the planet's solid interior. The descent stage struck the surface with the kinetic energy equivalent to detonating 1 ton of TNT. The seismometers registered the impact exactly as expected. The sharp spike appeared on the readouts at Mission Control. Engineers leaned forward, watching the needles trace the moon's response. And then the moon began to ring. Not a brief reverberation, not a rapid decay into silence. A sustained resonant vibration that continued for 55 minutes. The seismometer needles traced waves that oscillated with unnatural regularity, as if the impact had struck not solid rock, but a hollow metal sphere. The vibrations maintained coherent frequency patterns, specific pitches that resonated and reinforced rather than damping out. In the Mission Control Observation Room, Dr. Morris Ewing, co-director of the Passive Seismic Experiment, watched the data stream in real time. He was a geophysicist, a man who had spent his career studying how seismic waves move through planetary bodies. He understood what the patterns should look like. This wasn't it. Later, in a press conference that received far less attention than the landing itself, Ewing would state. As for the meaning of it, I'd rather not make an interpretation right now, but it is as though someone had struck a bell, say in the belfry of a church, a single blow, and found that the reverberation from it continued for 30 minutes. Note the careful phrasing. As though someone had struck a bell. Not like a bell, but as if an actual bell had been struck. And note what he didn't say. What kind of interior structure would produce that effect? Because the answer was too disturbing to speak aloud in an official NASA briefing. If you've ever struck a bell, you know the sound. The initial impact produces a sharp note, but then the metal continues to vibrate, singing out the resonant frequencies determined by its shape and composition. The sound sustains because the bell is hollow, and the material, metal, usually bronze or steel, has high acoustic impedance. Energy doesn't dissipate quickly through metal. It reverberates, creating standing waves that reinforce the dominant frequencies. Solid rock doesn't behave this way. When you strike solid rock, the seismic energy scatters through a heterogeneous interior, different densities, different compositions, cracks and fissures that break up the wavefront. The signal decays rapidly, usually within minutes at most. The moon's reverberation lasted nearly an hour, but NASA had only preliminary data from Apollo 12. Perhaps it was an anomaly. Perhaps the specific geology of the Oceanus Procellarum region where Apollo 12 landed contained unusual rock formations that created unexpected resonance. Science demands replication. Apollo 13 provided it, though not as planned, April 14th, 1970. Apollo 13's mission to land in the Fra Mauro Highlands was aborted after an oxygen tank explosion crippled the service module. The crew survived through a combination of engineering brilliance and luck that seemed too precise to be entirely accidental, but that's another thread. What matters for our investigation is what happened to the third stage of the Saturn V rocket, the SIVA-B booster that had propelled the command module toward the moon. After separating from the spacecraft, the massive booster stage was deliberately crashed into the lunar surface as part of the ongoing seismometer experiments. The impact occurred at approximately 8,094 kilometers per hour. The energy release was equivalent to detonating 11 tons of TNT, 11 times more powerful than the Apollo 12 lunar module impact. The seismometers, still operating from the Apollo 12 mission, recorded the collision. Once again, the initial spike appeared exactly as expected, and once again, the moon began to ring. This time, the reverberation lasted 3 hours and 20 minutes. Dr. Clive R. Neal, a geologist at the University of Notre Dame who has spent decades studying the Apollo seismic data, noted in a 2006 paper, "The moon was ringing like a bell, which means it's very much unlike the Earth, which rings like a broken bell. A broken bell. That's what Earth sounds like seismically, fractured, heterogeneous, damping. The moon sounds like an intact bell, uniform, resonant, hollow." Let's pause and understand what hollow means in this context, because the word carries implications that make geologists uncomfortable. No one is suggesting the moon is completely empty inside, a literal bubble floating in space. The data don't support that. What the seismic evidence does suggest is that the moon's interior is fundamentally different from what planetary formation models predict. When planets and large moons form through accretion, countless smaller objects colliding and merging over millions of years, they develop layered structures. The heaviest materials, primarily iron and nickel, sink to the center through gravitational differentiation, forming a dense metallic core. Lighter rocky materials form the mantle. The lightest materials rise to form the crust. This is basic planetary science. Earth has an iron core roughly 3,500 kilometers in diameter. Mars has a core approximately 1,800 kilometers across. Even small bodies like Mercury have substantial cores. The Moon should have a core roughly 480 kilometers in diameter based on its total mass. But seismic data from the Apollo missions suggests something far smaller, perhaps as little as 240 kilometers, possibly less. Some analyses indicate the core might be partially molten, which creates additional problems because a molten core requires internal heat, and the Moon shows no signs of the volcanic activity that should accompany a heat-generating interior. More troubling is the Moon's overall density. The Moon's average density is 3.34 grams per cubic centimeter. Earth's density is 5.52 GJ3. This difference isn't trivial. If the Moon formed from Earth's mantle material, as the Theia impact hypothesis suggests, it should have a density closer to Earth's mantle density, around 4.5 GJ3. Instead, it's significantly less dense, as if substantial portions of the interior are missing or composed of something lighter than rock. The numbers don't resolve. The Moon weighs too little for its size. Its core is too small or possibly absent, and when you strike it, it resonates like a manufactured structure rather than a naturally formed planetary body. In 1970, two Soviet scientists, Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Sherbakov, published a provocative article in Sputnik magazine titled, "Is the Moon the Creation of Alien Intelligence?" They proposed that the Moon might be a hollow shell, a manufactured sphere with a rocky outer layer several kilometers thick, concealing an internal cavity. They argued this would explain the density discrepancy, the seismic data, and several other anomalies we'll examine in later chapters. Western scientists dismissed the paper as Soviet sensationalism, but they never adequately addressed the core question. If the Moon isn't hollow, why does it sound hollow? Why does it ring with sustained resonance, completely unlike any other planetary body we've studied? Picture yourself in mission control that day in 1969. You're surrounded by engineers, physicists, geologists, the best scientific minds NASA could assemble. You've just watched seismometer data stream in from the Moon for nearly an hour. The needles are still trembling, recording vibrations that should have stopped 45 minutes ago. Someone makes a joke about ringing the doorbell. Nervous laughter spreads through the room because humor is how humans process cognitive dissonance. But beneath the laughter, you feel it, the wrongness. The data are telling you something no one wants to hear. The Moon is not behaving like a moon, it's behaving like something else. Dr. Ken Johnson, who worked with the Apollo photo archive, later recalled the atmosphere in those early days of data analysis. We were finding things that didn't fit, not small discrepancies, fundamental contradictions. And the directive was always the same: find an explanation that fits the standard model. We weren't allowed to follow the data if the data led somewhere uncomfortable. The standard explanation for the Moon's ring-in eventually settled on a theory involving dry, fractured rock. The argument goes like this: the Moon lacks water in its interior, unlike Earth. Without water to dampen vibrations and with an interior heavily fractured by billions of years of meteor impacts, seismic waves can propagate through the rock in ways that create sustained resonance. It's plausible, just plausible enough to file away and forget. But it doesn't explain the pattern of the resonance, those coherent frequencies, those specific pitches that sustained for hours. Random fracturing produces scattering, not reinforcement, so you don't get bell-like tones from shattered rock. You get noise, unless the fracturing isn't random, unless the interior structure is organized in a way that creates acoustic resonance chambers, unless what the seismometers detected was exactly what it sounded like, a hollow shell resonating after being struck. There's another piece of evidence that rarely appears in official NASA documentation but circulates in the technical literature. During the Apollo missions, several seismometers recorded what came to be called moonquakes, seismic events originating within the moon's interior, unrelated to meteor impacts or human activity. These moonquakes occurred with disturbing regularity. They clustered at specific depths, around 800 to 1,000 kilometers below the surface. They happened at predictable intervals, often coinciding with the moon's closest approach to Earth in its orbit, perigee, when tidal stresses are greatest. And they produced seismic signatures completely unlike earthquakes. Earthquakes on Earth typically last seconds to minutes. The seismic waves build, peak, and decay in a pattern determined by the slip of tectonic plates or the fracturing of rock. Moonquakes, by contrast, built gradually, sustained at peak intensity for extended periods, then decayed slowly, like a bell being struck softly at first, then harder, then allowed to fade. Dr. Yoshio Nakamura, who led the analysis of Apollo seismic data at the University of Texas, noted that the deep moonquakes exhibited extremely efficient seismic wave propagation. The waves traveled through the lunar interior with minimal energy loss, suggesting the material was either highly uniform or structured in ways that channeled the energy rather than dispersing it. Why would the moon's interior be uniform at depths of 800 to 1,000 kilometers? Natural planetary formation produces exactly the opposite, increasing heterogeneity as different materials settle into layers. Unless the uniformity is intentional, unless the interior was constructed rather than accreted. Let's consider what it means to build a hollow moon, not whether it's possible. We'll address that in later chapters when we discuss who might have done it. For now, let's just examine the engineering logic. If you wanted to place a large observation platform in orbit around a planet, you have two options. First, you could build a space station, a relatively small structure, lightweight, easily maneuverable. This works for short-term missions, but presents problems for long-term observation. Space stations require constant maintenance. They're vulnerable to meteor impacts. They have limited internal volume for equipment, supplies, and personnel, if personnel are involved. Second, you could build or convert a moon. Take a planetary body, hollow out the interior, reinforce the shell, install your observation equipment in the protected cavity. The outer layer of rock serves as armor against meteor impacts and radiation. The mass provides gravitational stability. The size offers enormous internal volume. And most importantly, it looks natural. Any species observing from the planet's surface sees a moon, not a spacecraft. Camouflage through mimicry. This is not speculative fantasy. This is engineering logic followed to its conclusion. If you wanted to observe a planet covertly for an extended period, say thousands of years, building a hollow moon and placing it in stable orbit is arguably the most efficient method. The resonance data, the density anomalies, the missing core, these aren't proof of artificial construction, but they're consistent with it. More consistent, in fact, than they are with any natural formation model we've developed. And here's what haunts the analysis. NASA stopped placing seismometers on the moon after Apollo 17. No subsequent mission, robotic or otherwise, has deployed instruments to continue studying the moon's interior structure. The Apollo seismic network operated from 1969 to 1977, providing 8 years of data. Then it was shut down. Why? Officially, budget constraints. The Apollo program had achieved its goals. Ongoing monitoring was deemed less scientifically valuable than new missions to other targets. But consider the timing. By 1977, researchers had 8 years of moonquake data, multiple impact experiments, and increasingly sophisticated analysis techniques. They were beginning to map the moon's interior structure in detail. They were finding more anomalies, more inconsistencies, more evidence that the interior didn't match any model of natural formation. And then they stopped looking. The data archives remain, of course. Researchers still publish papers analyzing the Apollo seismic records. But no new data are being collected. We have 8 years of observation from instruments deployed over 50 years ago. Since then, silence. It's as if someone at NASA looked at what the data were revealing and decided it was better not to know. Better to let the question remain unanswered than to risk discovering an answer no one wanted to hear. Tonight, the moon crosses the sky above you, silent and cold. It looks solid from here, cratered, ancient, dead. But inside, if the seismic data are correct, something else exists. Cavities, voids, spaces that shouldn't be there, structures that resonate when struck, that ring like metal, that propagate vibrations with mechanical precision. Imagine standing on the lunar surface, not as the Apollo astronauts did, briefly, carefully, tethered to the illusion of safety their spacesuits provided, but somehow protected with time to think. Imagine striking the ground with a hammer. Now imagine hearing the sound continue for an hour. Imagine feeling the vibration through your boots, sustained and coherent, while you stand on what you've been told is a dead rock. How long before you realize you're standing on something built? How long before you understand that the silence of the moon isn't the silence of death, but the silence of something waiting? The Apollo 12 and 13 impacts weren't the last times the moon rang. Subsequent Apollo missions created additional impacts. Each time, the resonance continued far longer than planetary geology could explain. Each time, the data suggested the same impossible conclusion. And each time, the official explanation remained: fractured rock, dry interior, unusual acoustic properties. File it away. Move on. Nothing to see here. But late at night, in university offices, where planetary scientists review the old data, the question persists. The seismometer records don't lie. The numbers don't change because they make us uncomfortable. The moon rang like a bell because something about its interior structure causes it to ring like a bell. And bells are not natural. Bells are made. In 1962, 7 years before Apollo 12 struck the moon and heard it ring, Gordon MacDonald, a NASA scientist and one of the early researchers studying the moon's gravitational field, published a paper in Astronautics magazine. In it, he noted that the moon's gravitational variations suggested a mass distribution inconsistent with a solid rocky body. He wrote, "If the astronomical data are reduced, it is found that the data require that the interior of the moon is more like a hollow than a homogeneous sphere." The paper appeared, was discussed briefly in scientific circles, then disappeared into the archives. MacDonald never pursued the implications publicly. He spent the rest of his career working on other projects, never returning to the question of the moon's interior structure with the same directness. Years later, a colleague asked him why he'd abandoned that line of research. According to the colleague's account, unverified but persistent in the oral history of NASA researchers, MacDonald replied, "Because I was asked to." Asked by whom? The colleague didn't say. The story might be apocryphal, but it illustrates something real: the boundary between acceptable inquiry and forbidden questions. The moon's resonance data push against that boundary. They suggest the interior is hollow or partially hollow. They raise the possibility of artificial construction. And at that point, the inquiry stops. Because if the moon is hollow, if it was constructed, then everything changes. The timeline of human history, the assumption that we're alone, the comfortable narrative that Earth developed in isolation, all of it collapses. And in its place rises a question NASA has never been willing to ask officially: who built it, and why? The seismometer data from Apollo 12 sit in NASA archives today, available for anyone to review. The waveforms are digitized, the analysis published in peer-reviewed journals. The evidence is public record, yet it remains curiously absent from popular understanding of what Apollo discovered. When people think of the Apollo missions, they remember the moonwalk, the flag planting, the one small step moment. They don't remember that we struck the moon and it rang for an hour. They don't remember that the data revealed an interior structure inconsistent with every model of natural planetary formation. This isn't conspiracy. This is selective attention. We remember what fits the story we want to tell. We forget what doesn't. But the moon remembers. The moon, hollow or partially hollow, singing its metallic note whenever something strikes its surface, continues its orbit unchanged, patient, silent, waiting for the next impact, the next test, the next opportunity to reveal what it is beneath the dust and craters. And somewhere in NASA's archives, locked in climate-controlled storage, sit hard drives containing 8 years of seismic data, moonquakes recorded at specific depths, impact reverberations lasting hours, waveforms that suggest structure rather than chaos. Somewhere, someone has analyzed that data completely. Someone has built models of the interior that account for the resonance. Someone has asked the question and followed it to its conclusion. But that conclusion has never been made public. The moon rang like a bell. The bell is still ringing, and we've stopped listening. In the next chapter, we'll examine something even more disturbing than the moon's ringing. We'll look at the testimony of ancient peoples who claim to remember a time before the moon existed, not metaphorically, not mythologically, literally. A time when the night sky held stars but no moon. Because if the moon is artificial, if it was placed in orbit rather than formed naturally, then it arrived at some specific point in history. And that arrival should have been remembered. should have been recorded, should have traumatized the survivors so completely that the memory burned itself into oral tradition and survived for millennia. And it did. They called themselves the Proselenes, those who came before the moon, and their testimony, ignored by mainstream archaeology, aligns perfectly with the moment when Earth's climate collapsed, coastlines drowned, and civilization reset. The moon arrived, the world ended, and something began watching. Chapter 3: The Time Before the Moon. There are people who remember, not individuals. No human lifespan stretches back 12,000 years, but cultures, oral traditions that compress time like sedimentary layers, where centuries become verses and catastrophes become refrains, repeated generation after generation, until the words themselves become sacred, inviolable, passed down with such care that even when their meaning blurs, their structure remains. And buried in those structures, across continents separated by oceans that should have prevented contact, the same impossible claim appears. There was a time before the moon. Classical scholars encountered this first in the works of Aristotle, who wrote in his Constitution of the Tegirons about the Arcadian people of Greece. The Arcadians claimed their ancestors were Proselenes, those who came before the moon. Not that their ancestors were ancient, but that they existed before the moon existed, before it hung in the sky, before it lit the night, before it pulled the tides. Apollonius Rhodius, the 3rd century BC Greek poet and scholar, recorded similar traditions about the Carians, an ancient people of Asia Minor. They too claimed to be Proselenes, descendants of tribes who lived when the night sky held stars but no moon. Plutarch mentioned these traditions skeptically, dismissing them as the exaggerations of peoples desperate to claim antiquity. But he recorded them nonetheless, preserving the claim even as he doubted it. The Romans called them ante lunam, before the moon. Ovid referenced the tradition. Pliny noted it. Censorinus, writing in the 3rd century AD, stated matter-of-factly, "The Arcadians claim that before the moon appeared in the sky, their ancestors were already inhabiting the mountains of Arcadia. These weren't fringe beliefs. These were foundational myths, identity-defining narratives that shaped how entire cultures understood their place in time." The Arcadians didn't just claim to be old, they claimed to predate the current cosmic order. They claimed to remember the sky changing. Move south and east, out of the Mediterranean and into sub-Saharan Africa. The Zulu people of southern Africa preserve oral traditions recorded by European missionaries in the 19th century, before colonization fully disrupted the transmission of pre-contact knowledge. Credo Mutwa, a Zulu Sangoma, traditional healer and keeper of oral history, recounted stories told to him by elders in the 1960s. According to these traditions, the moon did not always exist. It arrived in the sky during the age of the first people, brought in what the Zulu called the egg of chaos, a cosmic vessel that descended from the heavens carrying the moon and those who made it. The arrival triggered catastrophe. The waters rose, the earth shook, and the old world drowned. The moon was placed in the sky to watch over humanity, to regulate the cycles, to control the tides. The Zulu traditions describe the moon's arrival not as a natural event, but as an act of installation. Something placed it there. Something wanted it in position. The moon became the eye in the sky, a surveillance device left behind by beings the Zulu oral history refers to as the Chitauri, reptilian entities who claimed dominion over Earth and shaped early human civilization according to their purposes. Dismiss this as mythology if you want, but note the structure. Beings arrive, moon is placed, catastrophe follows, survivors rebuild under observation. The same narrative architecture we've already encountered in Mesopotamian flood myths, in the Sumerian king list, in the boundary between pre-flood and post-flood kingship. Different cultures, different languages, same sequence. In Finland are the Kalevala, an epic poem compiled in the 19th century from ancient oral traditions, describes the creation of the heavens. The sun and moon are not primordial. They are made by a divine smith named Ilmarinen, forged from materials and set into the sky. The poem describes a time before their placement when the world existed in dim twilight, lit only by stars. The imagery is mythological, yes, but beneath the personification of cosmic forces as gods and smiths lies a memory. The sky was not always as it is now. The moon was not always present. In Tibetan traditions, preserved in texts that predate Buddhism's arrival in Tibet, there are references to a time when the sky had no silver face. The moon is described as arriving during an age of upheaval when the mountains rose and the waters swallowed the lowlands. The placement of the moon marked the beginning of the current world age, separating the before time from the time of measurement. The same pattern in the Vedic texts of India. The moon, Chandra, is described in the Rig Veda as being placed in the heavens by the gods, set into motion to mark time. Earlier Vedic hymns, composed before 1500 BC, but drawing on much older oral traditions, describe a primordial chaos before the cosmic order was established. The moon's placement is part of that ordering, an act of construction, not natural formation. Why would cultures separated by thousands of miles preserve the same impossible memory? The standard anthropological explanation invokes universal myth-making patterns. Humans create origin stories. They personify natural phenomena. They invent golden ages that predate recorded history. The moon, so visually dominant, naturally becomes a focus of creation mythology. But this explanation collapses under the specificity. These aren't vague creation myths where the moon forms from primordial waters or emerges from a god's body part. These are testimonies of arrival, of the sky changing, of a before and an after separated by catastrophe. And the catastrophe they describe aligns precisely with the Younger Dryas boundary, 12,800 BC. The moment when Earth's climate collapsed, ice sheets shattered, sea levels rose 120 meters over the following millennia, and coastlines where any advanced Ice Age civilization would have built drowned beneath the waves. If the moon arrived at this moment, if its gravitational capture or deliberate placement destabilized Earth's crust and triggered megafloods, then survivors would remember. They would remember the sky on fire, the comet fragments NASA now admits struck Earth at the Younger Dryas boundary. They would remember the waters rising, the catastrophic glacial melt, and they would remember the new light that appeared in the night sky afterward, not gradually, not naturally, but suddenly, like something installed. The Proselenes, the Zulu, the Finns, the Tibetans, the Vedic composers, they're all remembering the same event, filtered through different cultural lenses. The moon's arrival, the world's ending, the reset. Look for the moon in the oldest archaeological records, and it's curiously absent. The Lascaux cave paintings in France dating to approximately 17,000 BC, depict animals, hunting scenes, and what appear to be star charts, no moon. The Chauvet cave paintings, even older at 30,000 BC, show the same. Stars, yes. Animals, yes. The moon, no. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built around 9600 BC, right after the Younger Dryas ended, contains elaborate astronomical carvings. Pillars depict constellations, animals representing asterisms, and what some researchers interpret as a record of the comet impact that triggered the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The moon appears in these carvings, but only in the later enclosures, the ones built after the site's initial construction. It's as if the builders started recording the sky as they remembered it. Stars, comets, catastrophe, and only later, once the moon had been in place long enough to become normal, did they begin incorporating it into their astronomical observations? Or perhaps they recorded it specifically because it was new, because it appeared, because survivors of the catastrophe looked up one night and saw something in the sky that hadn't been there before, and they carved it into stone so future generations would remember this is when it arrived. The Sumerian cuneiform tablets, our oldest written records, show a similar pattern. The earliest Sumerian texts, dating to around 3400 BC, focus on grain tallies, temple administration, and economic transactions. When mythology appears in writing around 2600 BC, the moon god Sin is already established, already worshipped, already understood as ancient. But earlier oral traditions, compressed into later epics, hint at the moon's arrival. In one fragmentary text from the library of Ashurbanipal, a damaged passage describes the gods placing the lights in the heavens to mark time after the flood. The sun and moon are not described as primordial. They are described as installed, set into position by the Anunnaki to regulate the post-flood world. The text is too damaged to translate completely. Key words are missing. The context is ambiguous, but the structure matches the global pattern: catastrophe, then the placement of the moon, then the regulation of time and tides under the watch of beings who claim authority over Earth's reorganized order. Tonight, look up at the moon and ask yourself, how would you remember if it suddenly appeared? You, personally, would know it was new. You'd tell everyone. But your children, born after the arrival, would know the moon as normal, as it's always been there, and their children even more so. Within 3 generations, the memory would compress into story. Within 10 generations, into myth. Within 100, only the structure would remain. There was a before, there was catastrophe, there was an after. And if your civilization collapsed in the catastrophe that accompanied the moon's arrival, if you lost writing, if you lost cities, if survivors scattered into small bands, struggling to rebuild, then the memory would degrade even faster. Within 1,000 years, the moon's arrival would be remembered only as the time the gods changed the sky. Within 5,000 years, as the creation of the lights. Within 10,000 years, as myth indistinguishable from fantasy. Unless you were careful, unless you made the memory sacred, unless you repeated it in ritual, in ceremony, in the initiation of knowledge keepers, generation after generation after generation. Unless you became the Proselenes, defining your identity by the single most important thing your ancestors witnessed: the moon arriving and the world ending. The moon wasn't always there. The ancients tell us this, not metaphorically, explicitly. And if they're right, then in the next chapter, we must confront the question that follows inevitably. How did it get there? What mechanism, natural or otherwise, places a moon-sized object into perfect circular orbit around Earth? The answer lives at the intersection of orbital mechanics and catastrophe, at the moment when physics and flood myths align, at the Younger Dryas boundary, where the evidence of cosmic impact and the testimony of global memory point to the same impossible conclusion. The moon arrived, and arrival requires arrival from somewhere. Chapter 4: The Capture. The official story goes like this. 4.5 billion years ago, a Mars-sized planetary body called Theia collided with early Earth in a glancing impact. The collision vaporized Theia's mantle and a portion of Earth's crust, sending debris into orbit. Over thousands of years, this debris coalesced through gravitational attraction into a single large satellite, our moon. This is the giant impact hypothesis, and it's the best explanation planetary scientists have developed to account for the moon's existence. It has problems. The moon's oxygen isotope ratios are identical to Earth's, suggesting common origin. But its overall chemistry is different. Lower iron content, different volatile element ratios. If it formed from Earth's mantle, it should match Earth's mantle composition almost exactly. It doesn't. The impact requires extraordinarily specific conditions. Theia must hit at exactly the right angle, approximately 45 degrees, at exactly the right velocity, and fragment in exactly the right way. Too shallow and the collision is deflecting. Too steep and Theia plunges into Earth's core without creating sufficient debris. The odds are not impossible, but they're uncomfortable, like rolling dice that land on exactly the number you need. And then there's the angular momentum problem. The Earth-Moon system possesses more rotational angular momentum than the giant impact models naturally produce. Something added energy to the system that the collision alone doesn't account for. But set these problems aside. Even if we accept the giant impact hypothesis, it places the moon's formation 4.5 billion years ago, long before life, long before any witness, long before any memory. It makes the moon ancient, primordial, unquestionably natural. Unless it isn't. There is another hypothesis, rarely discussed in mainstream planetary science because it requires abandoning comfortable assumptions. The capture hypothesis suggests the moon formed elsewhere, perhaps in an independent orbit around the sun, and was later captured by Earth's gravity. Gravitational capture of satellites is not impossible. Mars's moons, Phobos and Deimos, are almost certainly captured asteroids. Neptune's moon Triton orbits retrograde, backward relative to Neptune's rotation, indicating it formed elsewhere and was captured. Capture happens. But it's messy. When a planetary body captures a satellite gravitationally, the resulting orbit is highly elliptical, chaotic, and unstable. Over millions of years, tidal forces gradually circularize the orbit, but the process takes time and leaves evidence in the orbital parameters. The moon's orbit is too circular, too stable, too perfect to be the result of recent capture. Unless recent means something different than we've been assuming. What if the moon was captured not 4.5 billion years ago, but 12,800 years ago? The idea seems absurd at first. Capture requires precise conditions: velocity, trajectory, gravitational timing. The odds of a rogue planetary body wandering into exactly the right position to be captured by Earth are infinitesimally small. Natural capture at any point in recent geological history is functionally impossible. But if the capture wasn't natural, if the moon was placed, then the odds become irrelevant. You don't need probability. You need propulsion, navigation, and intent. 12,800 years ago, something happened to Earth. The evidence is written in geological layers across continents, in ice cores from Greenland, in sediment deposits from lakes and ocean floors. At the Younger Dryas boundary, we find platinum anomalies. Concentrations of platinum group elements hundreds of times higher than background levels, suggesting extraterrestrial origin. Nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that form only under extreme pressure and temperature, consistent with cosmic impacts. Magnetic microspherules, tiny iron-rich spheres formed when material is vaporized and rapidly cooled, exactly what happens during airburst explosions. A global burn layer, widespread charcoal and soot indicating continent-scale wildfires occurring simultaneously. Sudden climate shift. Within decades, global temperatures plunged back into Ice Age conditions, remaining cold for 1,200 years before abruptly warming again. The leading hypothesis attributes these markers to fragments of a disintegrating comet striking Earth's atmosphere. Not a single massive impact, like the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, but multiple airbursts across the northern hemisphere, explosions in the sky that ignited firestorms, melted ice sheets, and triggered catastrophic flooding. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It remains controversial, debated, not fully accepted by all geologists. But the evidence keeps accumulating. Every new ice core, every new sediment analysis adds weight to the conclusion that something struck Earth 12,800 years ago with enough force to reset the climate and erase any coastal civilizations that might have existed. Now add one more variable, the moon's arrival. If a moon-sized object entered Earth's orbital space at the Younger Dryas boundary, the gravitational effects would be catastrophic even before any physical capture occurred. The moon's mass is 7.35 1022 kilograms, roughly 1/81st of Earth's mass. That's enormous gravitational influence. As the moon approached, Earth's crust would begin to bulge toward it, pulled by tidal forces. The oceans would rise in massive tidal waves, not the meter-scale tides we experience today, but mega tsunamis hundreds of meters high, racing around the planet as the gravitational pull moved overhead. The ice sheets covering Canada and northern Europe, already destabilized by the comet impacts, would fracture completely. Cubic kilometers of ice would collapse into the oceans in a matter of days or weeks. Sea levels would rise not gradually over millennia, but catastrophically over years. Volcanic activity would spike as crustal stress deformed tectonic plates. Earthquakes would occur globally. The planet would be literally torn at by competing gravitational forces. The sun pulling one way, the arriving moon pulling another, Earth's rotation resisting both. This is what the flood myths describe. Not rain, not slow rising waters. Catastrophe, the world broken. The old order erased in a violence so total that survivors could barely comprehend what had happened. And then, after the moon settled into stable orbit, after the tidal forces equilibrated, after the waters found their new level and the crust stabilized, then the world could begin again, smaller, diminished, regulated by the tidal rhythms of a moon that now controlled the oceans, the climate, the very rotation of the Earth itself. How would you place a moon in orbit? The engineering is straightforward, conceptually. You need propulsion to slow the moon to the correct orbital velocity. You need navigation to position it at the correct altitude. You need stabilization systems to circularize the orbit and lock the rotation tidally. The energy requirements are staggering by our standards, but only by our standards. A civilization capable of hollowing out a planetary body and converting it into a spacecraft would possess energy generation technology we can't currently imagine. Perhaps fusion, perhaps zero-point energy extraction, perhaps something we don't have vocabulary for yet. The point is, if you can hollow out the moon, you can move it. And if you can move it, you can place it. The question isn't whether it's possible. The question is why? Why go to the enormous effort of capturing or constructing a moon and positioning it in Earth orbit? What purpose does it serve? We'll explore the answers in chapters ahead: observation, regulation, quarantine. But first, understand the placement itself. The moon's orbit is not random. It's not the chaotic ellipse of a recently captured body. It's a perfect circle, near enough, stabilized, tidally locked, positioned at exactly the distance required to create total solar eclipses. That's a signature. That's a message written in orbital mechanics. This was placed. This is not an accident. Look up and know something built this. The survivors of the Younger Dryas catastrophe emerged into a world transformed. Coastlines had moved hundreds of miles inland. Ice sheets had retreated. The climate had destabilized, then restabilized under new parameters. And in the night sky, a new light hung where no light had hung before. They didn't understand orbital mechanics. They didn't know the moon was 384,400 kilometers away. They only knew that something vast and bright now watched them from above, pulling at the waters, marking time in monthly cycles, never turning away. So they built monuments. Göbekli Tepe, with its massive stone pillars arranged in circles that mirror celestial patterns. Temples oriented to lunar cycles. Calendar systems based on the moon's phases. They encoded the arrival in myth, in ritual, in the foundations of their rebuilt civilizations. And they remembered, in oral traditions that survived for millennia, in the testimony of the Proselenes, in flood myths that describe not just water, but cosmic disruption, in Sumerian texts that speak of kingship descending from heaven after the flood, not metaphor, but description of a new order imposed from above after catastrophe erased the old. The moon arrived. The evidence, geological, mythological, astronomical, points to the same moment. 12,800 years ago, at the Younger Dryas boundary, Earth's sky changed, and with it, everything else. In the next chapter, we'll examine what that arrival did, how the moon's gravitational influence reshaped Earth's oceans, stabilized its climate, and locked the planet into rhythms that every living thing now obeys. The tides rose, the world drowned, and survivors learned to measure time by the face of the machine that now controlled it. Chapter 5, The Tides of Destruction. Imagine Earth without the moon, not as it is now with the moon absent, but as it would have been before the moon arrived, a different planet operating under different physical laws. Without the moon's gravitational influence, Earth's axial tilt would be unstable. Currently, Earth's axis tilts at approximately 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane around the Sun. This tilt creates our seasons: summer, when your hemisphere tilts toward the Sun; winter, when it tilts away. The Moon's gravitational pull stabilizes this tilt, preventing it from wobbling chaotically over geological time. Without that stabilization, computer models suggest Earth's axial tilt could vary anywhere from 0 to 85 degrees over periods of millions of years. 0 degrees means no seasons. The equator receives constant maximum sunlight while the poles remain in perpetual cold. 85 degrees means extreme seasons. The poles would bake under continuous summer sun for half the year, then freeze in total winter darkness for the other half. Climate would be chaotic. Ice ages would come and go unpredictably. Life would struggle to adapt to conditions that changed faster than evolution could track. This is what Earth might have been like before 12,800 years ago: unstable, unpredictable, hostile to the development of complex civilization. Then the Moon arrived. The immediate effects would have been catastrophic. We've touched on this, but let's walk through the sequence in detail, step by step, as a survivor might have experienced it. You live in a coastal settlement, let's say in the Persian Gulf Basin, which during the Ice Age was not underwater, but a fertile river valley where the Tigris and Euphrates converged before flowing south to a distant ocean. Your people have lived here for generations. Perhaps you have permanent structures, agriculture, astronomical observations recorded in stone. Perhaps you are part of the lost civilization that built what we now call Göbekli Tepe further north. One night, the sky changes. A new light appears, dim at first, growing brighter over days or weeks as something massive approaches from deep space. Perhaps comets fragment in the upper atmosphere, creating fireballs that streak across the heavens. Perhaps the approaching object itself is visible, growing from a distant star-like point to a disk, to a vast sphere that looms over the horizon. Then it stops, or rather, it settles into orbit, and immediately the world begins to break. The first effect would be the tides. Currently, the Moon's gravity pulls Earth's oceans into a bulge. High tide on the side facing the Moon, another high tide on the opposite side due to centrifugal force, low tides in between. The difference between high and low tide varies by location but averages about 0.5 meters in open ocean, amplified to several meters in coastal areas due to local geography. These tides are gentle because they've been operating for thousands of years. The water has learned the rhythm. The Moon's position is predictable. Everything is equilibrated. But when the Moon first arrived, there was no equilibrium. If it entered Earth's gravitational well over a period of days or weeks before settling into stable orbit, the tidal forces would be dynamic, changing magnitude and direction as the Moon's position shifted. Imagine standing on the coast when the first massive tide arrives. Not a gentle rise of water over 6 hours, but a sudden surge, a wall of ocean pulled toward the approaching Moon, racing across the basin at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Tsunamis generated not by earthquakes, but by gravity itself, reaching heights that would dwarf anything in recorded history. Your settlement, built on the assumption that water levels are stable, would be obliterated in minutes. The flood myths describe this: waters rising until they covered the mountains, arriving so fast that only those warned in advance had time to escape to high ground. and the waters wouldn't recede quickly. As the moon settled into orbit, the new equilibrium sea level would be higher than before because the moon's gravitational pull doesn't just create temporary tides, it permanently alters the shape of Earth's oceans. Areas closer to the moon's orbital plane would experience sustained higher water levels. Coastlines would move inland by dozens or hundreds of kilometers and stay there. The geological record confirms this. At the end of the Younger Dryas, approximately 11,600 years ago, sea levels rose dramatically. The standard explanation attributes this to melting ice sheets as the climate warmed, but the rate of rise shows anomalies. Meltwater pulse, 1b, dated to around 11,500 years ago, saw sea levels jump by approximately 7.5 meters in less than 200 years, an average of 3.75 centimeters per year. That's rapid for geological processes, but the archaeological evidence suggests something faster. Coastal settlements abandoned suddenly, submerged structures showing no signs of gradual retreat, flood layers deposited in single catastrophic events rather than gradual accumulation. What if the ice sheets melted not just from warming climate, but from gravitational stress? As the moon approached, tidal forces would act on Earth's crust itself, not just the oceans. The ice sheets, 2 miles thick in places, would experience internal stress as the moon's gravity pulled at their mass. Fractures would propagate. Massive chunks would calve into the ocean. The process would accelerate catastrophically. Lake Agassiz, a vast glacial lake larger than all current Great Lakes combined, drained catastrophically multiple times during the Younger Dryas period. Orthodox geology attributes this to ice dam failures as the climate warmed. But consider an alternative. The ice dams failed because gravitational tidal forces from the arriving moon fractured them. Billions of tons of fresh water dumped into the North Atlantic in weeks or days, disrupting ocean currents and triggering the climate instability that defines the Younger Dryas period. But the moon's influence didn't stop with the oceans. Charles Hapgood, a historian and geographer, proposed in the 1950s a theory called Earth crust displacement. The theory suggests that Earth's outer crust can, under certain conditions, shift rapidly relative to the interior, causing continents to move thousands of kilometers in short geological time frames. Mainstream geology rejected the theory because it lacked a plausible mechanism. What force could move the entire crust? Plate tectonics explains gradual continental drift through convection currents in the mantle, but rapid displacement requires something more dramatic. The moon's arrival provides that mechanism. If a moon-sized object entered Earth's orbit over days or weeks, the tidal forces acting on Earth's crust would be immense. The crust floats on the semi-molten mantle below. Given sufficient gravitational stress, it could slip, not completely, not rotating the entire crust, but shifting enough to move polar ice caps into lower latitudes where they would melt rapidly, and moving formerly temperate regions into polar positions where they would freeze. This would explain the mystery of frozen mammoths found in Siberia with undigested food still in their stomachs, evidence of sudden freezing, as if the region went from temperate to Arctic in days rather than years. It would explain the rapid extinction of megafauna across continents at the Younger Dryas boundary, not from human hunting or gradual climate change, but from catastrophic environmental disruption as the very ground shifted beneath them. Hapgood's theory remains controversial, but if the moon arrived 12,800 years ago, if its gravitational influence destabilized Earth's crust even temporarily, then what seemed impossible becomes plausible. After the catastrophe, after the waters found their new level and the crust stabilized, Earth would be different. The moon's presence would regulate the axial tilt, preventing the chaotic wobbling that characterized the pre-lunar world. Day length would stabilize. The tides would settle into predictable rhythms. For survivors, this would feel like the establishment of cosmic order. The chaos would end, time would become measurable, seasons would become predictable. The moon would mark months, the sun would mark years. The world would operate according to laws that could be learned, predicted, and used to organize agriculture, ritual, and civilization itself. This is what the myths describe. After the flood, the gods established order. They separated the waters from the land. They set the lights in the heavens to mark time, not creation ex nihilo, but reorganization. The imposition of structure on chaos, and at the center of that new order, hanging in the sky, always watching, the moon, no longer an approaching threat, but a permanent fixture, the regulator, the timekeeper, the eye that never closes. Tonight, when you see the tide rise and fall, understand you're watching the moon's gravity pulling at 1.335 billion cubic kilometers of ocean water. Every coastline on Earth moves in rhythm with its passage. Every harbor, every beach, every tidal estuary operates according to schedules published in tables calculated years in advance, because the moon's motion is that predictable. This is what control looks like. Not a tyrant giving orders, but a system so perfectly calibrated that everything within it obeys without conscious thought. The tides don't choose to rise. They rise because the moon pulls them. And if the moon pulls the oceans, what else does it pull? In the next chapter, we'll examine the moon's connection to the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. We'll explore why every ancient culture described the moon not just as a light, but as an eye, an observer, a consciousness that watches and records. We'll trace the line from Sumerian moon god Sin to the Egyptian eye of Horus to the watchers of Enochian tradition, and we'll ask the question that mythology poses but science refuses to answer. Is the moon watching us? And if so, on whose behalf? The tides rose, the world drowned, and in the aftermath, survivors looked up to see their new regulator hanging in the sky, silent and eternal, marking time in a world that would never be as it was before. Chapter 6. The Watchers. In Sumerian cuneiform, the moon god is written as Nana in Sumerian, Sin in Akkadian. He is not a god of light or beauty. He is a god of measurement. His primary function is to count the days, mark the months, and maintain the calendar by which all human activity is organized. The Sumerian hymns describe Sin as the lamp of heaven and earth, but more importantly, as he who determines destinies. Not through prophecy or divine whim, but through observation. Sin sees what happens beneath the moon's light. He records it. He reports to the higher gods, specifically to Enlil, the executive deity who enforces cosmic law. Sin's symbol is the crescent, almost always depicted with horns pointing upward. In cylinder seal carvings, Sin appears not as a distant celestial body, but as an active presence. sometimes anthropomorphic with a long beard, sometimes represented purely by the crescent symbol positioned above scenes of human activity, always watching. His temple in Ur, one of the most important religious sites in ancient Mesopotamia, was called Alsi Gish Shirgal, House of the Great Light. But the rituals performed there weren't celebrations of illumination, they were acts of reporting. Priests would recite the events of the previous month to Sin's image, maintaining the illusion or memory that the moon received information and transmitted it upward to divine authority. This is not how humans naturally relate to celestial objects. We don't report to the sun. We don't submit monthly activity summaries to Venus or Jupiter, but to the moon, the Sumerians did, as if they understood the moon's presence as more than passive, as if it were a relay station, a surveillance node, a mechanism through which observation occurred. In Egypt, the lunar deity splits into two aspects, Thoth and Khonsu. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and wisdom, is credited with inventing hieroglyphics, mathematics, and astronomy, all systems of recording. He is the scribe of the gods, the keeper of divine knowledge, and significantly, he is associated with the moon's measurement function. The Egyptian calendar, based on lunar months, was said to be Thoth's gift to humanity. Khonsu means traveler, the one who moves through the sky. His name implies motion, crossing, passage. He is depicted as a young man with the lunar crescent and disk on his head, often holding a crook and flail like the pharaohs. He doesn't create or destroy. He moves. He observes. He marks time. And then there's the Eye of Horus, the Wedjat eye, one of the most recognizable symbols from ancient Egypt. It represents both solar and lunar aspects, but specifically in its lunar form, it symbolizes completeness restored. According to myth, Horus's eye was torn out by Set during their cosmic battle, and later restored by Thoth. The eye became a symbol of healing, protection, and most importantly, seeing. The eye doesn't just look, it sees, actively, consciously. Temple inscriptions describe it as the eye that rests not, the vigilant eye, the instrument through which the gods observe the activities of humans and maintain Ma'at, cosmic order. Why an eye? Why not describe the moon as a shield, a wheel, a lamp? Because eyes are organs of observation. Eyes imply consciousness behind them. Eyes watch. Move forward 2,000 years to the Book of Enoch, a Jewish apocalyptic text composed around 300 BC but claiming to preserve much older traditions. Chapter 6 describes the Watchers, the Irance angels assigned to observe Earth and report to heaven. The Watchers are not passive. They descend. They interact with humanity. They teach forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, weaponry, astronomy, and crucially, they are described as violating their mandate. Instead of merely observing, they take wives from among human women, producing offspring called the Nephilim. God's response is catastrophic, the flood. The Watchers are imprisoned. Their hybrid offspring are destroyed. Humanity is reset. And after the flood, the text implies, a new dispensation begins, one where the Watchers remain distant, confined to their observational role, no longer permitted to descend. The structure should be familiar by now. Beings from above observe Earth. They intervene. The intervention produces corruption or chaos. A flood resets the system. After the flood, the observers remain but at a greater distance, their interaction with humanity mediated through prophets, visions, and indirect communication rather than direct presence? And where do the watchers watch from? The text doesn't say explicitly, but they are celestial beings. They dwell in the heavens. They see what happens on earth. They are positioned between God's throne and human activity, intermediaries, observers, positioned precisely where a lunar observation platform would be. The pattern repeats across cultures with unnerving consistency. In Hindu tradition, Chandra, the moon, is personified as a deity who watches over the night, but more importantly, he is cursed to wax and wane as punishment for transgression. The cycle of the moon's phases is explained not through orbital mechanics, but through divine surveillance. Chandra must show his face gradually, never all at once, as a constant reminder that he is being watched, even as he watches. In Mayan cosmology, the moon goddess Ixchel is associated with divination and prophecy, the ability to see what is hidden. She is both the observer and the revelator, the one who sees and the one who makes visible. The Chinese lunar traditions describe the moon as the residence of Chang'e, who lives in eternal exile after stealing the elixir of immortality. She watches Earth from her lunar palace, unable to return. The imagery is telling. The moon is not empty. Something resides there, something that was once on Earth, but is now distant, observing from separation. Why would independent cultures all arrive at the same metaphor? Why describe the moon as inhabited, as conscious, as actively watching? Perhaps because it is. Return to Mesopotamia. The Anunnaki, those beings described in Sumerian texts as coming from heaven to earth, establishing kingship, organizing civilization, are often associated with celestial bodies. Anu, the supreme deity, represents heaven itself. His name means sky. The Anunnaki are his offspring, beings who move between the celestial realm and earth. In later Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki become judges, the council that determines fates, witnesses human actions, and enforces cosmic law. They don't rule Earth directly anymore. That role has transferred to mortal kings. But they observe, they maintain oversight, and their primary instrument of observation, according to the astronomical texts, is the lunar cycle. The Mulapin tablets, Babylonian astronomical compendiums copied from older Sumerian sources, describe the moon's movement with extraordinary precision. But more than that, they describe it as purposeful. The moon's phases are not random. They mark divisions of time that correspond to ritual obligations, to periods when the gods are attentive or distant, to windows when divine observation is strongest. This is not primitive astronomy. This is a description of a surveillance system operating on a schedule. If the moon is an observation platform, if it was placed in orbit 12,800 years ago after a catastrophic reset, then who is doing the observing? The texts offer answers, but they speak in languages we've tried to demythologize. Anunnaki, watchers, Neteru, Egyptian divine principles, Devas, Hindu celestial beings. Strip away the theological overlay, and you're left with a consistent description. Intelligences from elsewhere who established a presence in Earth's orbital space, who observe human activity, who once intervened directly but now maintain distance, and who operate through systems of law and measurement designed to regulate rather than rule. The moon is not God. The texts never claim it is. But it is divine, meaning it belongs to the realm of the Anunnaki, the watchers, the gods. It is their instrument, their eye, their relay station between Earth and whatever authority exists beyond. When sin receives reports from when Thoth records human deeds, when the watchers observe from their celestial stations, they're not metaphors. They're descriptions of a system that required infrastructure, and that infrastructure, if it exists, would need to be placed somewhere permanent, somewhere stable, somewhere that provides continuous line of sight to Earth's surface, exactly where the moon is. Look up tonight. The moon crosses the sky, predictable as clockwork. It shows you the same face it has shown every human who has ever lived. It never turns away. Not once in recorded history has the moon's far side been visible from Earth's surface. Why? Tidal locking, say the physicists. Gravitational interaction over geological time has synchronized the moon's rotation with its orbit. This is natural. This is expected. Most large moons in the solar system eventually become tidally locked. But the perfection of the locking is unusual. The moon doesn't wobble significantly. There's minimal libration, slight apparent oscillation that reveals a tiny bit more surface over time, but never the far side. It's as if the moon is deliberately oriented, not just passively locked. And what is on the far side? We didn't know until 1989, when the Soviet Luna 3 probe flew around the moon and photographed what had been hidden since. Since when? Since the moon formed 4.5 billion years ago, according to the official timeline, or since 12,800 years ago, when it arrived and someone positioned it, with the far side facing away from Earth, hidden, protected, kept secret. In the next chapter, we'll examine what biological systems, including human biology, respond to the moon's presence. We'll look at cycles that shouldn't exist if the moon were natural, at frequencies that align too perfectly to be coincidence, at evidence that the moon doesn't just pull water, it pulls at consciousness itself, tuning biological rhythms to its schedule, like instruments in an orchestra tuned to a conductor's frequency. The moon watches. But does it do more than watch? Does it regulate? And if so, what happens to those who fall out of sync with its frequency? Chapter 7, The Biological Frequency. The human menstrual cycle averages 29.5 days. The lunar month, the time it takes the moon to complete one orbit around Earth and return to the same phase, is 29.53 days. Coincidence, say the biologists, thus evolutionary accident. The similarity is close but not exact, and besides, not all women cycle at precisely 29.5 days. Individual variation proves the correlation is meaningless. But step back, look at the pattern across populations, across cultures, across the entire human species. The average hovers at 29.5 days with remarkable consistency, and this synchronization exists in humans, but not in most other mammalian species. Dogs cycle every 6 to 8 months, cats every 2 to 3 weeks, horses every 21 days, rats every 4 to 5 days. Why would human reproductive cycling align so precisely with the moon's phases if the moon is irrelevant to biology? The standard evolutionary explanation suggests that early humans, as nocturnal or crepuscular primates, might have used moonlight to coordinate reproductive behavior, increased visibility during full moons, creating opportunities for mating. Over millions of years, this behavioral correlation became physiologically embedded. It's plausible, but it requires millions of years of lunar influence, millions of years during which the moon already existed, already exerted its gravitational pull, already cycled through its phases. What if the correlation happened faster? What if human biology synchronized to the lunar cycle, not through gradual evolutionary adaptation, but through direct exposure beginning 12 out of 800 years ago when the moon arrived? What if our bodies learned the moon's rhythm because they had to, because the moon's gravitational field operates on frequencies that biological systems cannot ignore? The human body is approximately 60% water. The brain, specifically, is about 73% water. Blood plasma is roughly 90% water. Cerebrospinal fluid, the liquid cushioning the brain and spinal cord, is essentially all water. The moon's gravity pulls at Earth's oceans, creating tides that rise and fall in precise rhythm with lunar cycles. Why would that same gravity not affect the water inside our bodies? The conventional answer is scale. The tidal force acting on the small volume of water in a human body is negligible compared to the force acting on an entire ocean. Technically true, but biological systems don't operate on simple mechanical principles. They operate on threshold effects, on signals amplified through cascades, on tiny inputs producing disproportionate outputs. Consider the pineal gland, a small endocrine organ buried deep in the brain, shaped like a pine cone, approximately 8 meters long. Despite its size, the pineal gland regulates circadian rhythms through melatonin production, influencing sleep-wake cycles, seasonal behaviors, and reproductive timing. The pineal gland is photosensitive. It responds to light entering the eyes, adjusting melatonin production based on day-night cycles. But it also responds to magnetic fields, a property documented in studies dating back to the 1980s. Birds use their pineal glands to navigate using Earth's magnetic field. Humans may retain vestigial sensitivity to magnetic fluctuations, and the moon generates magnetic effects. As the moon passes overhead, it creates subtle variations in Earth's magnetic field through gravitational interaction with the planet's molten iron core. These variations are tiny, measured in nanoteslas, but biological magnetoreception operates at that scale. What if the pineal gland responds not just to sunlight, but to lunar magnetic signatures? What if the 29.5-day menstrual cycle is not an evolutionary relic, but an active entrainment, the body's internal clock constantly recalibrating to match the moon's electromagnetic signature? Then there's lunacy. The word itself reveals ancient understanding: luna, moon, plus a psi, state of being affected by, moon madness. The belief that full moons trigger psychological disturbances, violent behavior, and mental instability. Modern psychiatry dismisses this as superstition. Multiple studies have attempted to correlate lunar phases with psychiatric emergency room admissions, violent crime rates, and suicide attempts. Most find no statistically significant relationship. The meta-analyses conclude the lunar effect on human behavior is a myth, but other studies, less publicized, less cited, find the opposite. A 2019 study published in Molecular Psychiatry analyzed over 17 million psychiatric hospital admissions in Switzerland and found a small but statistically significant increase in admissions during full moons. A 2000 study from the British Medical Journal found increased incidence of animal bites during full moons. Multiple studies from emergency rooms in different countries report anecdotal but persistent patterns. Full moon nights are different. Why the inconsistency? Perhaps because the lunar effect is not uniform across all individuals. Perhaps it operates on those whose neurological systems are already unstable, amplifying existing conditions rather than creating new ones. Perhaps the effect is real but subtle, easily masked by noise in large data sets, but unmistakable to those who work night shifts in psychiatric wards and emergency rooms. The nurses know. Ask any ER nurse if the full moon matters, and most will say yes, not because they believe in astrology, but because they've worked enough full moon shifts to recognize the pattern. More agitation, more violence, more bizarre behavior. Not in everyone, but in enough people to be noticeable. Sleep studies add another layer. Research on sleep quality shows that during full moons, even in controlled laboratory environments with no windows or visual cues, human subjects experience reduced total sleep time, average 20 minutes less, decreased deep sleep, stage 3-4 non-REM sleep, reduced by 30%, lower melatonin levels increased, time to fall asleep takes 5 minutes longer on average. This happens even when participants don't know what phase the moon is in, even when they're isolated from moonlight. The effect persists. The proposed mechanism involves electromagnetic sensitivity. The moon's gravitational pull creates subtle variations in Earth's electromagnetic field. These variations interact with the pineal gland's magnetic sensitivity, suppressing melatonin production slightly during full moons when the moon's illuminated face is fully visible from Earth and its gravitational pull aligns with Earth's position relative to the sun. It's a weak effect, but it's measurable, and if the moon can alter sleep patterns in controlled laboratory conditions, what else can it alter? Consider the tides inside the skull. Cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, circulates through the brain and spinal cord in rhythmic pulses, driven partly by arterial pressure and partly by respiration. The volume of CSF in an adult human is approximately 150 milliliters. Not much, but enough to matter. During a typical day, CSF pressure varies by about 5 to 15 meters Hg. This is normal, regulated by production and absorption rates. But what if the moon's gravitational pull adds a tiny additional pressure variation, too small to be clinically significant in most people, but enough to affect those whose intracranial pressure regulation is already compromised? Conditions like idiopathic intracranial hypertension, migraines, and certain seizure disorders involve CSF pressure dysregulation. Patients with these conditions often report symptom worsening during full moons, dismissed by doctors as coincidence or confirmation bias, but experienced consistently enough that the patients themselves track lunar phases to anticipate bad days. What if they're right? What if the moon's gravity does create tidal effects in cranial fluids? And what if those effects, negligible in healthy individuals, become problematic in those whose regulatory systems are impaired? This would explain why the lunar effect appears inconsistent in studies. Most people have sufficient physiological buffers to absorb the moon's influence without noticeable symptoms. But a subset, those with pre-existing neurological vulnerabilities, cross a threshold. The moon doesn't create madness. It amplifies instability that already exists. Now consider this from an engineering perspective. If you wanted to monitor a biological population, you'd need a way to mark individuals within that population. Radio tags work for animals. RFID chips work for inventory. But for humans, billions of them, reproducing across generations, spreading across continents, you'd need something subtler. What if the moon's electromagnetic signature serves as a carrier wave, not transmitting information to humans, but receiving it, or rather detecting variations in how individual biological systems respond to the lunar frequency. Healthy individuals entrain smoothly. Their circadian rhythms align with lunar cycles. Their sleep-wake patterns, reproductive cycles, and mood variations oscillate within expected parameters. They're synchronized, harmonized, predictable, but those who don't synchronize, those whose neurological systems resist entrainment or respond erratically, would stand out. Not to human observers, but to whatever monitoring system tracks biological responses to the lunar signal. This is speculation, but it fits the pattern, the moon as regulator, not just of tides and time, but of biological rhythms, not controlling individual behavior, but maintaining a baseline frequency against which deviations become measurable. In ancient ritual traditions, lunar phases determined when ceremonies could be performed, when offerings were required, when communication with the divine was possible or forbidden. The full moon opened channels. The new moon closed them. Specific phases corresponded to specific divine presences being attentive or absent. Modern practitioners dismiss this as symbolic. But what if the ancients understood something we've forgotten? What if they recognized that during certain lunar phases, the barrier between consciousness and what? Higher dimensions, observation systems, divine awareness becomes thinner? Shamanic traditions worldwide describe the full moon as a time of heightened psychic sensitivity. Vision quests are timed to lunar cycles. Initiation rituals occur during specific phases. The moon isn't worshipped, it's used as a tool for accessing altered states, for receiving visions, for making contact with whatever intelligences exist beyond ordinary perception. And perhaps that's the point. The moon doesn't just watch passively, it mediates. It creates windows during which certain types of consciousness can perceive what's normally hidden, during which the monitoring system becomes momentarily visible to those sensitive enough to detect it. The full moon pulls at water. It pulls at CSF. It pulls at electromagnetic fields in the brain. And for a brief window, a few nights each month, the signal becomes strong enough that some people, whether through genetics or training or accident, can feel the presence behind the light. They describe it as madness because they have no other vocabulary. But maybe it's not madness. Maybe it's clarity. Brief, terrifying clarity that something vast and cold is watching through the lens of the moon, and during the full moon, when the lens is fully open, those with unstable neurological filters can sense the gaze pressing down. Tonight, if the moon is full, stand outside and let the light fall on you. Feel the cold luminescence on your skin. Notice if your sleep is restless. Notice if thoughts become intrusive, if emotions amplify, if the boundary between inner and outer becomes permeable in ways that daylight doesn't permit. You've been taught this is superstition, but your ancestors knew better. They tracked lunar phases obsessively not because they believed in magic, but because they recognized patterns. During certain phases, things changed, behaviors shifted, rhythms altered, the world became less stable. And perhaps that instability is the point. Perhaps the moon doesn't just observe. Perhaps it tests, applying periodic stress to biological systems, measuring how they respond, identifying which organisms maintain synchronization and which fall out of phase. In the next chapter, we'll examine what's on the surface, structures that shouldn't exist, geometric patterns and craters, anomalies photographed by NASA missions, and quietly filed away. We'll look at the shard, the tower, the glass-like formations that official explanations dismiss as camera artifacts or lighting tricks. But before we go there, understand this. The biological frequency is real. Your body responds to the moon whether you're conscious of it or not. And if your body responds, then so do billions of other bodies. A planetary population entrained to the same rhythm, marching to the same beat, synchronized to the schedule of something that watches from above. The moon pulls the tides, the moon marks time, and the moon perhaps sorts the synchronized from the deviant, the harmonized from the discordant, the obedient from the resistant. What happens to those who resist? We don't know, but they're the ones who see most clearly during the full moon. And what they see keeps them awake until dawn. Chapter 8, The Glass Structures. November 1966, lunar orbiter detached swept across the moon's surface at an altitude of 46 kilometers, photographing potential landing sites for the upcoming Apollo missions. Frame 61H2 captured something in the sea of tranquility that mission analysts couldn't explain. Rising from the lunar surface, casting a distinct shadow, stood what appeared to be a geometric structure, not a rock formation, not a crater rim, a spire, thin, symmetrical, approximately 1.5 kilometers tall based on shadow length calculations. NASA cataloged it as the shard. Internal memos discussed it. Analysts enhanced the image, measured the angles, calculated the geometry. Then it disappeared from public releases. The photograph existed in NASA archives, but wasn't included in official mission summaries. No press conferences, no scientific papers, just a cataloged anomaly filed away. When independent researchers obtained the image through Freedom of Information Act requests, decades later, NASA's official response was consistent. Camera artifact, unusual lighting angle, grain in the film emulsion, creating the illusion of structure where none exists. Except the shard casts a shadow. Artifacts don't cast shadows, and the shadow's length and angle are consistent with an object rising 1.5 kilometers above the surface, illuminated by sunlight at a specific angle during the orbital pass. The shard wasn't alone. Frame 67H3 from Lunar Orbiter 3 captured another anomaly, the tower, sometimes called the cube or castle. This structure appeared to be massive, rising approximately 11 kilometers above the lunar surface, based on shadow analysis. Geometric, angular, sitting on elevated terrain in a way that suggested it wasn't natural geology. Richard Hoagland, former NASA consultant and controversial researcher, obtained the original negatives and subjected them to digital enhancement using techniques unavailable in the 1960s. His analysis, published in the 1990s, suggested the tower exhibited right angles, parallel surfaces, and symmetry inconsistent with natural rock formations. NASA's response: optical illusion, data compression artifact, misidentification of natural features amplified by low-resolution imagery, and human pattern recognition bias, pareidolia. But here's what makes dismissal difficult. Those objects appear in multiple frames from different orbital passes at different lighting angles. If they were artifacts, they should change or disappear when the camera position shifts. They don't. They remain consistent across multiple photographs, suggesting their physical features on the lunar surface, not errors in image processing. Then there are the Blair cuspids, 7 spire-like objects arranged in geometric pattern photographed by lunar orbiter the Tunu in 1966. They form what appears to be a precise geometric arrangement, a central spire with 6 surrounding spires positioned at regular intervals, creating a hexagonal pattern. The objects cast shadows proportional to heights ranging from 60 to 90 meters. They appear equidistant from each other, approximately 5 kilometers, spacing between each spire. The pattern is too regular to be volcanic, too precise to be random. Lunar Orbiter mission scientist William Blair, after whom the formation is named, noted the arrangement in his mission report, but offered no explanation. The photographs were filed. The anomaly was documented, but never investigated further. Why? If natural processes created these formations, studying them would reveal new insights into lunar geology. If they're artificial, that's even more significant. Either way, they warrant investigation, yet no subsequent mission, Apollo or otherwise, targeted these areas for close-up photography or surface exploration. It's as if NASA looked at the anomalies, cataloged them, then deliberately avoided looking closer. Consider what constitutes evidence of artificial structure: geometry, right angles, parallel lines, symmetry, reflective surfaces distinct from surrounding terrain, repeated patterns suggesting construction rather than natural formation. The shard exhibits vertical geometry and casts shadows consistent with a manufactured spire. The tower shows angular features and massive scale inconsistent with impact ejecta or volcanic formations. The Blair cuspids demonstrate spacing and arrangement that suggests intentional placement. None of this is proof, but it's data. Data that raises questions. Questions NASA has declined to answer. When Apollo missions deployed surface experiments, they landed in regions chosen for safety and scientific value: flat mare regions, highland boundaries, accessible terrain. None landed near the shard, the tower, or the Blair cuspids. Officially, those sites were too risky or scientifically less interesting than selected landing zones. But look at the orbital tracks of later missions. Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, launched in 2009, has photographed the moon's surface at resolutions far higher than 1960s technology. It can resolve features smaller than a meter. It's photographed the Apollo landing sites, showing the descent stages still sitting where the astronauts left them. Has it photographed the shard at similar resolution? The tower? The Blair cuspids? The data exists, but it's not prominently published. Researchers who request high-resolution images of specific anomalous regions report difficulty obtaining them, not outright refusal, but delays, incomplete datasets, images released at lower resolution than the orbiter's capabilities allow. Then there's the glass. Multiple Apollo astronauts reported seeing unusual reflective surfaces on the lunar surface, areas that gleamed as if coated with glass or crystalline material. Some described geometric patterns within these reflective zones. Official explanation: impact glass. When meteors strike the lunar surface at high velocity, the heat melts rock into glass. This is real and documented, but impact glass appears as scattered deposits, irregular patches, chaotic distribution patterns. What astronauts described and what appears in certain orbital photographs suggests organized structures, lines, grids, patterns. Hoagland and other researchers claim to have identified what they call glass domes in certain lunar regions, transparent or translucent structures, visible only when lighting angles create refractive effects. The claims are controversial, the evidence disputed, But the original observation that the moon displays unusual reflective properties in localized areas is documented in official mission transcripts. Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin mentioned seeing a light in a crater during the approach to the landing site. Apollo 12 astronauts reported a glint from a distant crater wall. Apollo 15's orbital surveys noted unusual albedo variations in specific regions. These are not dramatic claims of alien bases. They're technical observations of unexpected optical properties. But they accumulate, and they suggest the lunar surface isn't uniformly what it appears to be: ancient regolith and impact-shattered rock. Something else exists in localized areas, something that reflects, refracts, or transmits light differently than surrounding terrain. The far side of the moon, never visible from Earth due to tidal locking, remained unseen until 1959, when the Soviet Luna 3 probe flew around and photographed it. The images were grainy, low resolution, but they revealed something unexpected. The far side looks dramatically different from the near side. The near side features large, dark maria, ancient lava plains. The far side has almost no maria, instead showing heavily cratered highlands. Why? The official explanation involves crustal thickness variations and asymmetric internal structure. But the asymmetry is extreme, as if the moon's two hemispheres formed under different conditions or served different purposes. If the moon is a constructed object, a spacecraft or observation platform, then the far side would be the logical location for internal access points, docking structures, or equipment that needed to be hidden from Earth's view. The near side would be the public face, smoothed maria, fewer structural features, the presentation side. This is speculation, but it's consistent with the tidal locking behavior. The moon shows Earth the same face always. The far side remains hidden, unexplored by human surface missions, photographed only by robotic orbiters whose data is filtered through NASA before public release. What's on the far side? We have photographs, we have topographic maps, but we don't have geologists on the surface examining the structures up close. We don't have drilling equipment analyzing subsurface composition. We have remote sensing data interpreted through the assumption that everything is natural, and if that assumption is wrong, we'd never know from current data. Tonight, look at the moon through binoculars if you have them. Notice the craters, thousands of them, overlapping, scattered, chaotic. Now look at the edges of the maria, the boundaries between dark plains and bright highlands. Notice how some lines are too straight, how certain formations seem geometric. You're seeing what Apollo astronauts saw, what orbital missions photographed, what NASA cataloged and filed away. The moon's surface holds secrets, not hidden in darkness, but hidden in plain sight, anomalies visible in official photographs, but never investigated, structures documented but never explained, patterns that suggest the moon is not entirely natural, but not entirely artificial either. Perhaps it's both. A planetary body, captured or constructed, then modified, hollowed out, equipped, positioned, its far side converted into functional infrastructure, while the near side remained relatively natural as camouflage. In the next chapter, we'll confront the question that all this evidence raises. Why? If the moon is artificial, if it was placed here, if it watches and regulates and tests, why? What purpose does it serve? Are we the zoo, carefully observed for research, or the prison, contained and monitored to prevent escape. The structures on the surface might be maintenance facilities, or they might be reminders, monuments left by whoever placed the moon, markers indicating that what seems natural isn't, that the prison walls exist even if most inmates never notice them. Chapter 9: The Quarantine Hypothesis. In 1950, physicist Enrico Fermi asked a question during a lunch conversation at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Where is everybody? The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Our galaxy contains between 100 and 400 billion stars. Conservative estimates suggest billions of potentially habitable planets. If intelligent life arose elsewhere, even once, it would have had millions or billions of years to develop technology, spread across the galaxy, and make its presence known. Yet we detect nothing. No radio signals, no megastructures, no evidence of galactic engineering. The silence is absolute. This is the Fermi paradox, and one proposed solution is the Zulu hypothesis. Advanced civilizations exist, but deliberately avoid contact. They observe primitive species like humans from a distance, studying our development without interference, the way scientists observe animals in nature reserves, maintaining the illusion of wilderness while controlling the boundaries. If this is true, if Earth is a zoo, then the zookeepers would need infrastructure, observation posts, monitoring equipment, something positioned where it could watch continuously without being obviously artificial, something like the moon. The Zulu hypothesis assumes benevolent, or at least neutral intent, observation for research, allowing natural development, minimal interference. But there's a darker interpretation. What if Earth isn't a zoo? What if it's a prison? Consider the evidence we've accumulated. The moon arrived 12,800 years ago during a catastrophic reset. Before that arrival, oral traditions suggest no moon existed. After the arrival, civilizations rebuilt under new constraints, stabilized axial tilt, regulated tides, biological rhythms entrained to lunar cycles. The Sumerian king list records rulers before the flood who reigned for tens of thousands of years, cosmic timescales. After the flood, reign lengths collapse into human lifespans. Something changed fundamentally, not just politically, but biologically. What if the pre-flood kings weren't mythological? What if they represented humans or human predecessors whose biology operated differently? Longer lifespans, different relationship to time, perhaps freedom from the lunar frequency that now regulates our circadian rhythms, our reproductive cycles, our neurological function. Then the moon arrived, the world reset, and survivors found themselves operating under new parameters. Shorter lives, biological clocks synchronized to the lunar month, consciousness entrained to frequencies they couldn't escape. This is what prisons do. They don't just contain bodies, they regulate behavior through environmental control. Light cycles, feeding schedules, routines that shape how inmates experience time and limit what they can imagine beyond the walls. What if the moon is the warden? Earth's position in the solar system is unusually isolated. We orbit in what astronomers call the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, perfect for liquid water and life. But we're also far from gas giants that might facilitate interplanetary travel through gravitational assists. We're positioned where leaving is difficult, but surviving is easy. The moon's presence makes leaving even harder. To escape Earth's gravity well and reach other planets, Spacecraft must first escape the Earth-Moon system. The Moon's gravity adds complexity to orbital calculations, narrows launch windows, increases fuel requirements. It doesn't make space travel impossible. Obviously, we've reached the Moon and sent probes beyond, but it adds a barrier. A barrier that wouldn't exist if Earth had no moon, or if it had a smaller, more distant satellite, like Mars's tiny moons Phobos and Deimos. Now consider how the moon affects our perception. It dominates the night sky. It marks time. It anchors mythology, religion, and culture. Every civilization that has existed since the moon's arrival has organized itself around lunar cycles, calendars, festivals, agricultural schedules, religious observances. The moon structures how we think about time itself, and time is the cage, not physical barriers, but the perception that this is how things are, have always been, will always be. The Gnostic texts, early Christian writings declared heretical and suppressed, describe Earth as a prison created by the demiurge, a false god who traps souls in material existence. Archons, servants of the demiurge, guard the boundaries and prevent escape to the true divine realm beyond. Strip away the theological language, and you have a description of a controlled environment. Earth isolated, humanity trapped, escape prevented by forces that most people never perceive as hostile because they've internalized the prison as reality. The moon, in this framework, is an archon technology, the physical manifestation of the boundary. It doesn't need to imprison us with visible walls. It imprisons us by regulating biology, marking time, structuring consciousness around rhythms we can't escape because they're embedded in our physiology. You can't revolt against your circadian rhythm. You can't refuse to menstruate according to the lunar month. You can't opt out of the tidal forces that pull at the water in your cells. The moon controls you through your own biology, and you call it natural because you've never known anything different. But what are we imprisoned from? Or what is imprisoned in us? One possibility, we're quarantined. Something about Earth or humanity is dangerous, not to us, but to whatever exists beyond. Perhaps our biology, perhaps our psychology, perhaps something in our history that makes us unsuitable for contact with galactic civilization. The Younger Dryas reset erased whatever we were before. The survivors, our ancestors, rebuilt under observation, their lifespans shortened, their cognitive abilities perhaps limited compared to what the pre-flood humans possessed. We're the descendants of prisoners, born into a system designed to contain whatever our ancestors represented. The moon watches not just to study us, but to ensure we don't redevelop whatever was dangerous about the pre-flood civilization. It monitors for deviations. It tests biological synchronization. Those who fall out of phase, the lunatics, the ones who see clearly during full moons, are identified, marked by their inability to entrain properly to the lunar frequency. What happens to them? Nothing overt, but they're visible to the monitoring system. And if the quarantine is real, if the moon's purpose is containment, then those who resist its influence would be noted, tracked, perhaps subtly influenced toward self-destruction through the very neurological instability that allows them to perceive the cage. Another possibility, we're the product, not the threat. Earth is a farm, humanity the crop, and the moon is the infrastructure that maintains optimal growing conditions. This is the darkest interpretation. The Anunnaki myths describe humans created to serve, to labor, to produce. What if that function continues? Not through direct slavery, that's inefficient, but through harvesting something humans generate naturally. Consciousness, emotion, worship. The ancients offered sacrifices to lunar deities, performed rituals during specific phases, directed prayers and devotion skyward. Modern humans still gaze at the moon with reverence, write poetry to it, structure romantic mythologies around moonlight. What if that attention, that directed consciousness, is what's being harvested, not through supernatural means, but through measurable electromagnetic radiation? Human brains generate electrical activity. Coherent thoughts produce coherent electromagnetic fields. Billions of humans synchronized to lunar rhythms, directing attention moonward during cultural moments, full moon celebrations, lunar New Year's, eclipse observations. That's focused electromagnetic energy on a planetary scale, energy that could be collected by a receiver positioned 384,400 kilometers away, energy that might serve purposes we can't comprehend because we've never operated at that technological level. This sounds like science fiction, but so would a smartphone sound like magic to someone from 1,000 years ago. We assume our current understanding of physics is complete, but we've only mapped a fraction of what exists. If the moon is artificial, if it was placed by intelligences far more advanced than us, then its functions might include capabilities we can't detect because we don't know what to look for. The question isn't whether these interpretations are literally true. The question is whether they're useful frameworks for understanding the evidence. The moon arrived during a catastrophe. It stabilized Earth's environment, but also regularized human biology. It watches constantly, but never reveals what's on its far side. It influences consciousness, regulates rhythms, and marks time in ways that structure civilization itself. Whether you call that a zoo, a prison, a farm, or a monitoring station, the function is the same. Control through environmental design, not tyranny. That's too obvious. Control through making the cage feel like nature, through embedding the boundaries so deeply into biology and culture that questioning them feels absurd. You don't see the moon as a prison because you were born inside it. Your ancestors were born inside it for over 400 generations. The memory of freedom, if it ever existed, has been erased. What remains is the vague discomfort some people feel during full moons, the intuition that something about the moon isn't quite right, the persistent mythologies across all cultures that describe the moon as watching, judging, controlling. Tonight, look up. See the moon not as a romantic light, not as a scientific curiosity, but as the possibility you've been avoiding. That you live in a designed environment, that your biology is regulated by external technology, that the freedom you assume you possess is constrained by boundaries you can't see because they're written into the laws of nature themselves, laws that were changed 12,800 years ago when the moon arrived. In the final chapter, we'll confront what it means to live with this question. Not to answer it definitively, we can't, not with current evidence, but to hold it, to let it reshape how you see the night sky, how you understand your place in the cosmos, and what you're willing to consider possible when the comfortable certainties dissolve and you're left staring at a light that might be staring back. Sponsor Chapter 10, The Final Question. We've traveled through layers of evidence that shouldn't fit together but do. Seismic data that suggests the moon rang like a bell when struck, hollow, resonant, metallic. Oral traditions from cultures separated by oceans claiming their ancestors lived before the moon existed. Geological markers at the Younger Dryas boundary indicating catastrophic cosmic impacts precisely when myths describe the flood and the sky changing. Gravitational effects that would have drowned coastlines and reset civilizations if a moon-sized object entered Earth's orbit. Mythologies depicting the moon not as passive light, but as an observer. Sin counting days, Thoth recording deeds, the watchers stationed in celestial positions. Biological rhythms synchronized to lunar cycles in ways evolution alone struggles to explain. Surface anomalies photographed by NASA missions, then quietly archived. And finally, the possibility that Earth itself is a controlled environment, zoo, prison, or farm, with the moon serving as infrastructure for that control. None of this is proof, but it's a pattern. And patterns demand recognition, even when recognition is uncomfortable. The question isn't whether you believe the moon is artificial. Belief is irrelevant. The question is whether you can hold the possibility without dismissing it reflexively, without retreating into the comfort of official explanations that leave too much unexplained. Let's acknowledge what we know with certainty. The moon exists. It orbits Earth in a nearly perfect circle, tidally locked, showing us the same face it has shown every human who has ever lived. It creates total solar eclipses through a ratio 400 times farther than its diameter is smaller than the sun's, that no other planet-moon system in our solar system replicates. It stabilizes Earth's axial tilt, regulates our tides, and influences biological rhythms in immeasurable ways. When we struck it with the force of 1 ton of TNT, it rang for 55 minutes. When we struck it with 11 tons of TNT, it rang for over 3 hours. Its density is too low for its size. Its core is too small or possibly absent. Its composition doesn't match what planetary formation models predict. These are facts, NASA data, peer-reviewed observations, not speculation. Now layer the mythology. Every ancient culture describes the moon as conscious, watching, judging. The Sumerians built temples to report monthly activities to Sin. The Egyptians depicted the Eye of Horus as lunar surveillance. The Book of Enoch describes watchers stationed in the heavens, observing Earth. The Proselenes of Arcadia claimed their ancestors predated the moon's appearance. The Zulu traditions describe the moon arriving in an egg of chaos and being placed in the sky to watch over humanity. These are also facts, not facts about the moon's nature, but facts about what humans have consistently believed and recorded for thousands of years across disconnected cultures. Finally, consider the timing. The Younger Dryas impact event, 12,800 years ago. The sudden emergence of monumental architecture at Göbekli Tepe, 11,600 years ago, exactly when the Younger Dryas ended. The flooding of coastlines where any Ice Age civilization would have built between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. The appearance of Sumerian civilization, already sophisticated, already possessing advanced mathematics and astronomy, 5,500 years ago. The standard narrative says humans transitioned naturally from hunter-gatherers to city builders through agriculture and gradual cultural evolution. But that narrative requires ignoring the speed of development, the sophistication appearing without visible antecedents, and the global flood myths all describing the same cataclysmic reset. The alternative narrative that civilization existed before, was destroyed, and rebuilt from fragments by survivors who preserved memory and myth, fits the evidence better. And if that narrative is true, if the Younger Dryas was a reset, then the moon's arrival at precisely that moment becomes not coincidence, but mechanism. What does it mean to live under a moon that might be watching? For most people, nothing changes. They'll continue seeing the moon as they always have, a beautiful natural satellite, a romantic light, a scientific curiosity. The evidence presented here won't penetrate because belief systems are fortresses. We defend them against information that threatens foundational assumptions. But for some, those who feel the wrongness during full moons, those who've always sensed something observing from above, those whose neurological systems refuse to synchronize properly with the lunar frequency. This framework offers something more valuable than proof. It offers permission to trust your instincts. You're not crazy for feeling watched. The moon's tidal locking means it's positioned perfectly for observation. You're not superstitious for noticing behavioral changes during full moons. The biological data supports electromagnetic influence on neurological function. You're not paranoid for questioning official explanations that leave the most important questions unasked. The moon rang like a bell. They stopped placing seismometers after discovering that fact. Draw your own conclusions. There's a reason this question unsettles us more than other conspiracy theories or fringe hypotheses. It's not about governments hiding information or corporations controlling narratives. It's deeper. It touches the boundary between what we can change and what we cannot. If the moon is artificial, if it was placed by intelligences far beyond our current capabilities, then we're not alone and never have been. Everything we've built, every civilization, every achievement, every moment of human history since the Younger Dryas has occurred under observation. Our biology, our consciousness, our very sense of time has been shaped by external technology operating at scales we can barely comprehend. We're not the authors of our own story. We're characters in someone else's experiment, zoo, prison, or farm. And the bars of the cage are written into physics itself, gravity, tides, electromagnetic frequencies, making escape not just difficult, but conceptually impossible, because we can't imagine freedom from forces we experience as nature. This is existentially destabilizing. It's why mainstream science refuses to seriously investigate the anomalies. Not because scientists are part of a cover-up, but because the implications are unbearable. Better to dismiss the seismic data as irrelevant, the surface structures as artifacts, the mythological testimony as primitive superstition. Better to maintain the comfortable narrative that we evolved naturally on an isolated planet, alone in the cosmos, masters of our own destiny. But comfort isn't truth, and truth doesn't care whether you're ready for it. So what do you do with this information? You can't escape the moon's influence. You can't opt out of tidal forces or circadian entrainment. You can't dismantle a surveillance system, if that's what it is, that operates at planetary scale. But you can see it. You can recognize the cage even if you can't leave it. You can understand that the biological rhythms you experience, the temporal structures you inhabit, the very framework of reality as you perceive it, might be designed rather than natural. And that recognition changes something fundamental. Not your circumstances, but your relationship to those circumstances. You stop taking the world at face value. You start questioning what seems self-evident. You hold the possibility that everything you've been taught about human origins, about the development of civilization, about our place in the cosmos, might be incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. This is what the ancients meant by gnosis, not belief, but direct knowledge that reality is not what it appears to be. The Gnostics described Earth as a prison guarded by archons. The Sumerians described kingship descending from heaven and humans created to serve. The Vedic texts describe cycles of creation and destruction spanning millions of years. Every tradition points to the same uncomfortable truth. We're not the first, we're not alone, and the world we inhabit was shaped by intelligences operating according to agendas we don't understand. The moon is the most visible piece of that infrastructure. It hangs in the sky, undeniable, and if you know what you're looking at, it's the crack in the official story where light from outside the system leaks through. Let's return to where we started. Tonight, step outside, look up. The moon is there as it has been every night of your life, as it will be every night until the day you die and beyond. It crosses the sky with mechanical precision. It shows you the same face it has shown every human who has ever lived. Marks time, pulls the tides, and regulates biological rhythms in ways science can measure but not fully explain. Feel the light on your skin, that cold, silver luminescence. Not warmth like the sun, but something else, something that makes you visible, something that knows you're there. You've been taught this is a rock, dead geology, a natural satellite captured billions of years ago through gravitational accident, nothing more. But rocks don't ring like bells for hours when struck. Rocks don't inspire universal mythologies of observation and judgment. Rocks don't arrive at the exact moment when planetary catastrophe resets civilization and then stabilize the environment into parameters perfect for controlled development. The moon might be a rock, but it might also be a machine, and machines serve purposes. The Sumerians knew this. The Egyptians knew this. The Proselenes, who claimed to predate the moon, knew this. They encoded the knowledge in myth, in ritual, in architectural alignments, in calendar systems, in stories told generation after generation, because they understood something we've forgotten. The world ended once, was reset, and something stayed behind to make sure it stays reset. The moon is that something. Patient, silent, eternal. Somewhere, 384,400 kilometers above you, a mass of 7.35 kilograms maintains its orbit. Inside that mass, if the seismic data are correct, are cavities, voids, spaces that shouldn't exist in a natural planetary body. The far side, the hemisphere you've never seen from Earth's surface, holds structures photographed by orbital missions, then archived without explanation. What's inside? What's on the hidden face? What purpose does it serve beyond the obvious functions of tidal regulation and axial stabilization? We don't know. And perhaps that's the point. The mystery itself serves a function. It keeps us looking up, wondering, directing our attention and consciousness skyward towards something that might be collecting that attention as systematically as it collects electromagnetic data on biological synchronization. Or perhaps the moon is simply what it appears to be, a natural satellite whose anomalous properties are coincidences that seem meaningful only because humans are pattern recognition machines desperate to find design in chaos. Both possibilities exist. The evidence doesn't resolve definitively, and that ambiguity is where you must live now, suspended between certainty and doubt, between the comfortable official narrative and the disturbing alternative. The final question isn't, is the moon artificial? The final question is, can you live with not knowing while holding the possibility that you're being watched? Because that's the test, not of intelligence or knowledge, but of psychological resilience. Can you function day to day, maintain relationships, build a life, pursue goals, experience joy and meaning, while simultaneously holding awareness that the fundamental nature of reality might be other than you were taught? Most people can't. The cognitive dissonance is too painful. They choose one side or the other, full acceptance of the official narrative or full immersion in conspiracy thinking. Both are forms of escape. Both provide certainty that relieves the tension of not knowing. But the truth, if it exists, lives in the tension. It lives in the space between what we're told and what we observe. It lives in the anomalies NASA archives but doesn't investigate. It lives in the seismic data showing the moon rang like a bell. It lives in oral traditions claiming the moon arrived. It lives in the biological synchronization we can't escape. It lives in you right now, standing outside, looking up, feeling the light on your skin, and wondering, maybe for the first time, maybe with new intensity, whether something is looking back. The moon will rise again tomorrow, and the night after, and every night for the rest of your life. It will pull the tides. It will mark time. It will regulate your circadian rhythms, whether you think about it or not. But now you know, or at least you suspect. And suspicion, once planted, grows in the dark like everything the moon illuminates. The world ended once. The clay tablets tell us this. The geological layers confirm it. The flood myths preserve it. And after the ending, something arrived in the sky that had never been there before. We've been living under its gaze ever since, rebuilding, relearning, remembering fragments of what was lost, and perhaps, if the darkest interpretation is true, never quite escaping the boundaries established when the moon settled into orbit and Earth became a controlled environment. But even prisoners can see the walls. Even zoo animals can recognize the bars. Even farms sometimes produce crops that look up at the sky and ask, who built this? Why are we here? What happens if we refuse to grow according to plan? The moon has no answers. It simply watches, eternal and patient, waiting for the day, if it ever comes, when humanity develops the capability to reach the far side, to drill beneath the surface, to discover what the seismic data have been suggesting for over 50 years. That we live beneath something hollow, something built, something placed. Until then, the question remains suspended in the night sky, reflecting sunlight, pulling tides, and watching a species that mostly doesn't notice it's being watched. But you notice now, and you'll never see the moon quite the same way again. The light falls, the world sleeps, and somewhere above, the machine keeps time.